صباح الخير تحياتي لكم جميعا.
Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen.
أرحب بكم
I'd like to welcome you and welcome the speakers, the females and males.
في هذه الجلسة سيكون التركيز
In this session we'll be focusing on the media and the Gulf crisis, the Qatar blockade, and the media. We'll look at the matter from different perspectives. We'll start with Dr. Noureddine Miladi. And you've got his bio and you've got the details, so I won't go into the bios. He'll be talking about the propaganda and the media when it comes to the professional status and the decline thereby of the media. Let's listen to the gentleman for 20 minutes and then we'll move to the second panelist. Please, the floor is yours. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Allah's blessings and His mercy. I will be speaking in English. As I told my colleagues, I'm indeed very glad to be amongst you, to contribute humbly.
What
at
I've
the
been saying
beginning of
is
this
I've been pleased
session,
to be part of this event, and I think this is an excellent opportunity because what has been going on during the last 6 months or so in the Gulf region has touched not only those who are citizens in these countries, but also touched every resident in the said countries. When I speak about Qatar, I think everyone in Qatar has been to a large extent touched. We've been also shocked by the media portrayal of what has been going on. And when I say this, I speak about what I described specifically as a decadence in the ethical standards of the blockading countries, of the media of the blockading countries, because the Arab countries, other regional countries, and indeed the whole world have been affected by the media since the beginning of the last century. That's why there have been volumes of debates with regard to ethics of journalism, ethics of communication, professional codes of conduct, and so forth. Because of the power of the media in influencing public opinion, and because of the tension between politicians and journalists, and because of the approach with regard to the extent to which the media can be a tool of ideological manipulation, or it has to be a space like what Habermas speaks about, is the sphere where people can freely speak and debate. Therefore, we speak about its social responsibility. So the ethical decadence that has happened during the last few months has actually brought everyone to a kind of standstill with regard to, okay, what's going on? Are we going to arrive to an extent where the media will become, in those blockading countries, a simple manipulating tool? And here I am going to name some of the media outlets. So I'm not going to shy away from that, because it's become something that no one can stop talking about. When you have an Arab media that has been in the forefront, some of them, during the last few decades, of free speech, of that atmosphere of intellectuals, and then all of a sudden, after a career of those media outlets, especially newspapers, and some of the television channels, after a career of, let's say, few decades, in the case of Al-Hayat, for example, in the case of Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, in the case of Al-NBC, in the case of Al-Bayan, and so forth. So you talk about those channels has become something else, have become outlets of something else, which I am going to talk about. That's my short intro. So the propaganda war, in a way, and I specifically here use the word propaganda because all of us here are interested in communication and media, and all of us know that volumes have been written since the beginning of the last century with regard to the media message. When it is manipulated, it becomes a propaganda tool. It may be of regimes, but also it may be of other lobbies in society. It can be anything. It can be a money lobby. It can be a political lobby. It can be a social lobby. All right? But it becomes an ideological tool for manipulation. And the references to some of the literature probably in front of us. But also the media have been also used as another form of a tool, not this time for manipulation, but for demonization of specific communities. And a plethora of material have been written about Orientalism, Edward Said stuff, and Islamophobia. The UK probably is very much known for the excellent material in terms of books, studies, academic stuff written by non-Arabs and non-Muslims. But this time speaking about the power of the media with regard to demonization of a community, of a race, of a religion. So Islamophobia has become a big brand that many people speak about nowadays. And I think Edward Said, in my opinion, in his Orientalism, and later on in his Covering Islam, spoke about this angle as a very, very dangerous kind of step on the left towards the demonization of a community. The aims of this work have been summarized in probably a few points. But what I wanted to do was specifically to take an angle of what has been going on. I know this conference is going to be very rich, and I've been very pleased to be probably the first among the speakers. So at least you remember what I say. Probably some of us will build on it. But I'm very pleased because I'm taking a small dot of the study of what has been going on with regard to the media, knowing that many other colleagues, whether from this country and from international universities and so forth, and other academics or from study centers, they're also going to hammer on other areas with regard to the media. So what I did specifically was to use discourse analysis of Norman Fairclough and try to apply it on a study on some of the newspapers of the Gulf countries. In my abstract, you will see that I said I'm going to make a comparison. But when I started working on it over summer, to be honest, it became too much. This is a project of a book for me, which is going to be, hopefully, to develop into a big project. But the fact is, it's become huge because of the data and because of the approach. So what I'm going to present today is a small area, in a way, just to probably get us into debate. Most of us are probably familiarized with what I'm going to say, but applying an analytical, academic, well-grounded tool is the CDA of Fairclough and many others, probably will help us to decipher the media message. So in my methodology, as I mentioned, I did specifically choose الشرق الأوسط, عكاظ, الرياض, البيان, الخليج, العربية.net, and skynewsarabia.com. Over 200 articles. I don't have an exact, to be honest, an exact count of what I've got. But over 200 articles, which I managed to pinpoint for June and July, which I think they are excellent material for analysis. Now, specifically, I use discourse, but also for those who are into methodologies, they will understand that you can't run away from talking about semiotics or semiology when you are studying the image. So with regard to studying the text, yes, I look into titles, I look into subtitles, and also I looked into leads. In most of the cases, I didn't have to go into the full text because, well, as some of many of the scholars who studied discourse analysis, I mean, they will confine themselves with simply looking at the text because the text itself is so emblematic when it comes to talking about the content of an article. The lead will help us more to probably have some more explanation of what is the author going to say, but that's it. You'll have the gist of what is the author, the article is all about by simply looking at the lead itself. A couple of lines, 3-4 lines will help us. I also analyzed, as you can see, a few images, looking at the connotation, symbolic meanings, looking at associations. When we have a caricature or a choice of an image manipulated by Photoshop, what does that signify? I look at some of the titles under those images and try to probably make some meanings out of them. And I try to look at what is included and what is included when we have a specific image, which is rather very interesting when you think about these in mind while doing this work. With regard to discourse analysis, obviously I'm not going to get into discourse analysis because it will take the whole session or my whole presentation. But for every colleague who probably is aware or familiar with discourse, I'm using 3 specific tools, which help me a lot as a guideline how to work on my analysis. First of all, and this is based on the model of Fairclough. I didn't invent it. I'm not as brainy as normal Fairclough. Here in his excellent biblical book, in a way, about discourse analysis, it's titled Discourse Analysis, if you'd like to Google it. He bases the analysis or discourse, or CDA, on 3 main elements. Study of the text, its features and functions. Secondly, its discursive practice, and the ideological potential use of language in society. And the third one probably is what is most important to me, because I'm looking at the ideological use of or effect or impact of language on public opinion in this case. In his book, Discourse Analysis, Fairclough speaks about that CDA looks at the role of language in sustaining power relation in society. It scrutinizes the symbolism of language being used and the form of political and social control that leads to. Would you be able to tell me when it is half time so that at least I know? Thank you. Thank you. So I have another 15 minutes. You didn't say that. It scrutinizes the symbolism of language being used and the form of political and social control that it leads to. Van Ditch and many others who looked into and discourse analysis. By the way, all of us know that Fairclough wasn't the first one. Stuart Hall also wrote a lot about discourse analysis and the power of the language. According to them, it becomes a hegemonic tool of not only supremacy of a group on the other, but the maintenance and legitimizing of control and social dominance. I'm going to read through this quickly before I come to the analysis, and trying to link that, as I said probably in the beginning, that Edward Said probably among the Eastern scholars who picked up the power of discourse and tried to apply it in Orientalism. So in Orientalism, Edward Said said. He speaks about the Orient as constructed by colonial powers during the 18th and 19th century as a tool of dominance. Orientalism, he argues, was a distillation of ideas about the Orient, its sensuality, its tendency to despotism, its aberration or aberrant mentality, its habits of inaccuracy, its backwardness, therefore leads to its control, as we read in Al-Istishraq or Orientalism. I'm going to present a few slides, first of all about the look at the text. And what I did was screenshots before they disappear. You know, all the websites, they may have lots of things in the first instance, in the first few hours. Sometimes they change them very quickly because of a complaint and because of so I was following these websites, and I was taking screenshots straight away. And I realized that probably after a few hours, some of the things would change. Some of the caricature would have disappeared, completely disappeared. So at least I have proofs now, all right, for what I'm analyzing. I didn't do a Google search. I actually went to all these newspapers and did a donkey work of following them one by one and taking screenshots from each newspaper and also the websites of the Al-Arabiya and also Sky News. And obviously I didn't go to the broadcasting stations, meaning Al-Arabiya TV and Sky News Arabia. For the obvious reasons, it's going to be an extra effort with regard to the recording material and keeping proofs and what have you. So I didn't do that. I'm sure many other colleagues would have done this approach in this conference. But I'm here probably trying to see. Actually, I cannot. It's not very clear to me. Yeah, the screen is not clear to me. I'm not sure, colleagues, how to make this big, but the technicians. But it's supposed to be clear on my laptop. It's not. So I need it bigger so that I can see the text because I didn't write any notes on them. So are the technicians here? Probably they can help me with making this screen bigger or just remove this. Yeah, because what you see there is not what I see here. Sorry. This is what I'm trying to say to the audience. I'm going to be very quick. Probably talk about 1 or 2 slides and then move to some of the conclusions so that I don't take a lot of the time of the session. But very obviously, the first category which I probably put together with regard to lots of the articles is related to the theme of terrorism. And here I've been trying to see how terrorism itself is framed and how Qatar is related to the issue of terrorism. Were there any explanations about terrorism? And were there any identifications or explanations of what terrorism means in general so that we can whether associate Qatar with it or we don't associate Qatar with it? So I think this was probably the major thematic quantity of my findings in a way. So the issue of terrorism, as you can see, even until now, it's been reverberating in different ways. And it's been linked to Qatar in different ways. Whether it is about money laundering, or about weapons, or about association with states, or it is about association with terrorist groups, or sometimes about things that they don't have to be a terrorist issue, but Qatar is, in this case, associated to terrorism. So this is probably the first theme. And if I had the time, probably I'll go through lots of the articles and how they appear. And the use of language is very direct. It's unusual in a way in journalism to simply describe a nation, a whole country, its leadership in a very flagrant language, which obviously in every article will amount to a court case. Every article I have seen will amount to a court case which the state of Qatar will definitely win. Period. So here I'm talking about a huge amount of material. I'm not sure how history will record this. I'm not sure how the state of Qatar will probably deal with this when everything will become okay, hopefully in a few months or few years. It is amazing. And I'm not sure how journalists and academics and study centers will record all of this kind of representation of a nation and link it to terrorism. So that's the first issue. I move to 2 minutes. Yeah, okay. I move to the terrorism in the caricature, or in the images that are to a large extent manipulated by Photoshop. Some of them turned into a kind of caricature. But here we, for example, well, I'm glad here I translated at least. This is my own translation. But I start with this. It's speaking how now we manage to quarantine the terrorism money, or the money that is channeled to terrorism. Okay? And you can see the handcuffs around the Qatar Riyal. Move. This is very dangerous about the nation. This is in the front page. Doha funds in London tainted with blood. Unimaginable to speak about another nation, a neighboring country, an Arab or Muslim country, about tainted with blood. The ticking bomb. Al-Tamimi put Qatar as a sacrifice. This is my translation. يعني تميم يضحي بقطر. هذا هو العنوان بالعربي. This is in Arabic. تميم يضحي بقطر. All right? Move on. The whole map of Qatar in black. And a very clear link to terrorism. I know I have another minute. Arab residents, the Qatar blockade is a civilized act against an adolescent nation. Abdullah bin Zayed called Qatar "Stop Supporting Terrorism" has bewildered Doha. Very quickly, as a form of quick conclusion, I've missed a lot, obviously, here in the analysis. But the first point, if I can have just another minute, yeah, is that okay? The reports around Qatar are about terrorism, social problems, how Qatar is breaking the law, how Qatar has become kha'ina, linked to treason, and on the border of crisis or bankruptcy. And this is a recurrent theme when it comes to the issue of the representation in general. Secondly, when Qatar appears in the news, in image or text, tends to be always in a negative form. No referral to a source of informed commentary on news events. Obviously, anyone who makes a simple comparison between, for example, Al Jazeera or lots of the Qatari media outlets, they will feel that there is a voice for the other, especially people from the Gulf states. They are not necessarily people against the Gulf states, but people who are saying something about. But in the Gulf media, the blockading countries, you don't have another voice. It's only one voice, which is a voice demonizing the state of Qatar.
So, in conclusion, one sentence.
In conclusion, one sentence.
You made a great presentation.
Thank you very much.
But
I'm all sweaty because
in conclusion, yes.
In a conclusion, I'd like to say, come back to the point, which is, in this case, the media has been used ideologically and manipulated to a large extent, which probably we are not going to be able to explain in this conference, except an ethical decadence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
I'm very sorry with the
very
apologies to everyone.
Informative. Thank you. We have two speakers in one. So Brannon and Deborah have been married for 31 years and are giving their presentation together for the first time in 31 years. So
trying to
welcome, and as I understood, you're going to be together 20 minutes. Right?
Yes. The guy, this looks.
Yes. Very good.
No,
Please.
I'm trying to get the thing for you, but
No,
seems
it's
to be
okay. I'll do
blocked.
it. It's okay.
So you all have the CV and the information. والفوكس راح يكون تغطية الإعلامية في أزمة الخليج وفي حصار قطر. No, it is 20 minutes for both. Yes. This is, yes, it's one paper presented by two authors, and it's a joint authorship.
Computer is frozen. The computer is frozen. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Restart?
Yeah, maybe restart. Well, they're restarting. I'll just get started. First of all, thank you so much.
You can use this. You can use this.
Yes. Muhim. So as he explained, husband and wife team who've kept in their lane, their individual lane for 31 years. My lane, new media and impact on society, politics, economy in the Middle East. His lane, Islamic studies, you know, fiqh, early Islamic history. But the interesting thing is, with this Gulf crisis, the two lanes are merging. And we found that if we combined our analytic powers, we could understand something about tactics in this Gulf crisis that we couldn't understand alone. So what we're going to talk to you about today is, we've been taught in our jobs to do bottom line up front. It's called bluff. You give your message first, one sentence, and then you start. Our bottom line up front is that in spite of power differences between what we call the Saudi and Friends coalition and Qatar and her friends, if you look just at power, the way Dr. Badi discussed earlier, hard power, military power, Qatar would lose in a minute. But ironically, the conflict demonstrates that there is something more than hard power here. So our bottom line is, why has Qatar won the Gulf crisis? And in order to explore that, we will look at three tactics that are being used. The tactic of information warfare, the tactic of blockading, and the tactic of using religion as a weapon, which I might add is ironic that the leader of the Ummah, the custodian of the two holy mosques, would use religion as a weapon. The reason that Qatar has won is that you cannot push around a small state and have the small state say, go away and have the big states win, right? Your power is only as great as your ability to tell somebody else who's weaker than you what to do. If the weaker party says, sorry, not playing your game, this creates a major risk for the big powers. Go and ask my government. They could write books and books to fill this room on the vulnerabilities of telling small powers what to do if they don't do what you say. Okay? And somebody should send that book to President Trump, because he's about to write a few new chapters. All right? You have to be more nuanced and sensitive to the power of small states. That's our main message. Are we getting it to work?
No. So the epitome of what we're interested in is a law that is on one of the PowerPoint slides in the United Arab Emirates to say or publish anything that in sympathy with Qatar results in what is about a $100,000 plus fine or up to 15 years in prison. So the reason we think this epitomizes what we're interested in is because on the one hand, we have Qatar, this small state that has this big footprint. And on the other hand, we have this insecure state, Saudi Arabia, who's overreacting and then in effect not even able to mention the name of the enemy without criminal prosecution. Yeah, because the PowerPoint's not on that computer. We need the HDMI.
Yeah, evidently I need to use the mic. So remember, I started by saying that Qatar is clearly a small state, and the Saudi and Friends coalition would be the big state in this case. Just in terms of trying to understand where Qatar exists in terms of hard power, military firepower, in relation to the coalition neighbors, I created a slide. You can see it if you come up to my computer after the talk. Just looking at the 2017 rankings to see where these countries exist. So in terms of the world, this is out of 135 countries that are being measured in terms of their firepower. Saudi Arabia ranks 24th in the world. UAE ranks 60th, which explains why UAE does what Saudi tells them to do. Qatar is 91st out of 135, so in the bottom third globally. And Egypt is number 10, which explains why Saudi might want Egypt on their team. The United States is number 1. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. But it would explain why, for Qatar, it would be very important to have more than 10,000 troops stationed just south of here.
So part of our argument is the reason why Qatar is successful is because they eliminate the military advantage because the United States, which is number 1, is friends with both Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So it cancels it out.
By the way, you might be watching an argument going on between the president of our country and the Secretary of State. According to the most recent news, Tillerson says that it's a myth that his position will be changed. But the other insider analysis says that within 2 weeks he will no longer be Secretary of State. And I had a meeting about a week and a half ago with General John Allen, who was instrumental in U.S. policy in the Middle East, and he was vehement in his denouncement of our president's first visit being to Saudi Arabia. According to General Allen, if you choose Saudi, you're on the wrong side. Here's the slide with military strength. I put Israel there because he asked me where does Israel rank when we were doing this, and I thought others might like to know. But it would be interesting to understand why the Israelis are allying with Saudi Arabia, which tell me strange partnerships emerging from this conflict. But if you were Egypt 10, Israel 15, you would have some sort of disparity or weakness in your perspective.
We have two concepts. We want to talk about the idea of a small state. We want to talk about the idea of an institution. Go ahead. I got it. It's on the screen.
So what defines a small state? The actual first theoretical literature on this concept emerged in the 1960s. And according to that definition, a small state is one that cannot obtain security through its own capabilities. So with small states, what you tend to see is that partnership is extremely important. And the most important thing about partnerships is to make sure that you have many cross-cutting, overlying partnerships. And it's like what I learned about wasta in Kuwait. There's wasta kabir wa wasta saghir. Okay? إذا عندك wasta kabir, this might help you at the ministerial level. But if you only have, if you need like to get your license renewed quickly, or you want to get a visa to some country, you need wasta saghir. If you're a small state, you understand this concept better than anybody else. So part of what is happening is that Saudi Arabia is trying to break up Qatar's autonomy in terms of ability to project power by interrupting those layers of wasta and saying you cannot be friends with Iran, and you also shouldn't be friends with Turkey. And it makes strategic sense if you are Qatar and you're trying to interrupt the ability to project power of Saudi Arabia, that you go and get their two closest frenemies. You like this term, frenemy? Friend and enemy combined. Depending on what day it is, it changes. But the basic point is Qatar has leveraged that regional power struggle to be able to maneuver around any kind of attempt of these other countries to sort of project power. Now, I want to clarify that just because Qatar is a small state does not mean that they don't have a big footprint. Okay, this building that we're sitting in right now is a demonstration of a big footprint. All right, building amazing structures. Just today in the newspaper, I have a visual aid. We have a new achievement by Qatar. They ranked the top of the entrepreneurial index for the region. Okay, this is ire, especially for Abu Dhabi, who would like to consider themselves untouchable in terms of being on the cutting edge of everything. Okay, so what we really have here is a sibling rivalry that Qatar keeps outperforming the two big brothers. All right? Next slide.
So the other concept is the idea of asymmetric, so the idea of insecure or bully states. So what is an insecure state? An insecure state is a state whose perceives that its domestic illegitimacy, and that perceived domestic illegitimacy causes it to overcompensate in foreign relations. So the reason that we're comparing it with a bully is because a bully is somebody who uses force or the threat of force to try to get others to like him, because he perceives that he's not liked by other people and he wants his status recognized. Often the bully picks on the person who makes him feel most insecure, and often the bully picks on the one thing that makes him feel most insecure at home. So in the case of, say, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Qatar is accused of supporting political opposition. They have more money than Saudi Arabia, and they also give free platforms to people who challenge the Islamic legitimacy of Saudi Arabia. Talk about the terrorist thing. Okay. So the idea of one state calling the other one a terrorist, we understand that in the concept of looking at an insecure state. The idea that somebody is a terrorist, as we perhaps know, is a label that only works if the accuser is actually recognized as having the authority of making that accusation. So in that case, the legitimacy has to be given to the person who's making the accusation. And the accusation is basically the ability to make the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate uses of force, or legitimate and illegitimate uses of certain ideas.
Just to add to that, I found in doing the research for this paper that it was interesting that both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have given Qaradawi awards in the past. And lo and behold, now one of the, I guess it was 13, now it's 6, but one of the points is that Qatar needs to distance itself from the Muslim Brotherhood, and as a symbol of that, they're supposed to extradite Qaradawi back to Egypt so that Sisi can have his way with him, which, of course, Qatar has said this is a domestic issue, this is our sovereignty, and we're not going to give in. But the basic point is that it seems to be flavor of the month in terms of who's the terrorist or who's supporting terrorism. Just last summer, Britain released a report through the Henry Jackson Foundation which found that almost all of the financing for terrorism of an Islamic flavor is linked in some way, shape, or form with Saudi Arabia. So it is interesting that Saudis would choose this particular sensitive issue to call out Qatar when, in fact, it's like who's calling the kettle black. This is a frame of reference that's a part of American colloquialism, but it's basically saying that, you project and you take on an issue where you're the most insecure. Okay?
So the general question we're asking is why has the blockade failed to constrain Qatar's power while in fact making Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and UAE appear weak? So we have three main explanations. So why don't you talk about the first three?
Where are you? I'm
the
on
three
the...
most important demands. We're on the last slide.
Okay.
It's on the screen over there.
I thought we were going to talk about information warfare and food as a weapon, but it looks like we've fast-forwarded. Probably better for the time anyway. So, three demands. In terms of information warfare, the biggest demand is that you disband Al Jazeera. And it's interesting to see two countries, UAE and Saudi Arabia, that, as we showed, are have much greater firepower and strength than Qatar, blame Qatar for sowing the seeds of insurrection and instability in both Saudi Arabia and UAE. And when they point to the demonstration of that, it's always Al Jazeera that is responsible for threatening the stability and strength of Saudi Arabia and UAE. And I think that the kind of power differential there should make you smile. Okay, it really builds on what Professor Badi was saying this morning, that we are in this zone where, semiotics have more power than the guns and tanks. So Qatar should be considering itself proud that they have built information infrastructures to the point where a state like Saudi Arabia, 24th in the world in terms of military firepower, considers their TV station to be such a major threat that they should start this big, huge debacle. Okay, next one.
So we also consider Hannah Arendt's idea to be very helpful here. She, in her book on violence, she writes that if the state has power and actually uses violence to try to coerce people, then it loses its power. So it shows that the state, in fact, doesn't have the power. So the three different tactics that we talked about, all three of them are directly linked to Saudi Arabia's claim that it has authority in these areas, and insofar as they fail, for example, their attempt to blockade food coming into Qatar. This is an Islamic concept. The Prophet Muhammad used it to get the Meccans to eventually give in to him, and Saudi Arabia fails. It makes them look really bad because they're in fact not being able to accomplish what the Prophet Muhammad was able to accomplish. So finally, we look at this in terms of sibling rivalries. So go ahead.
He's turning it over to me. As the mother of three sons, I understand this concept better than most. But definitely with sibling rivalries, sometimes the battle is over things that you wouldn't expect, like who has the tallest building. Evidently, it's going to be in Jeddah soon, if it is finished. It's interesting. I always explain Kuwait's position. It's like Norway. Kuwait is like Norway. We don't need to have the tallest building. We don't need to have an indoor ski resort. We have the confidence in who we are and our ability to sort of let our voice be the voice of moderation. And I am very, very happy to see both Kuwaitis and Omanis here at this conference. So, more power to you for being a part of the solution rather than the problem. In conclusion, I know we said we were going to speak less than 20 minutes, but I wanted to say that as evidence of the fact that Qatar is winning, we should realize that everything that the Gulf coalition against Qatar tried to achieve has failed. Number one, Al Jazeera is stronger than ever. Talk about good PR for Al Jazeera. This conflict has done more to promote the station than anything else. Yes, and as we've seen from our president, fake news works as good as real news. So, not that Qatar's in the business of fake news, but I'm saying that it's evidence that they have succeeded on that. In terms of relations with Turkey and Iran, the partnership has never been stronger. in terms of Qatar's position, so that has failed. And in terms of, what was the last one I'm looking for?
Well, militarily,
yes.
the threat from the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to militarily intervene in Qatar failed because the United States, who's partners with all three.
Yes. And as evidence of the fact that they are winning in terms of the national struggle, I think all of us have seen here in Qatar the demonstration of the people being behind their leader have been overt. So it has made Qatar as a nation stronger and as a society stronger. And I'm hoping to get one of those stickers so I can put it on our car when we get home. Yes. Yeah, Sheikh Tamim al-Majid is what I was trying to remember with the phrase. So we'd be happy to send the whole paper, which is much better organized and more complete and longer than 20 minutes, if anybody has any interest, and we look forward to conversations in the interactive period. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very helpful for explaining so many events in the last few months. Our last presentation, Dr. Nawaf Al-Tamimi from the Doha Institute. تفضل.
شكرا دكتور. يمكن الدرس الأهم اللي تعلمته.
Perhaps the lesson that I learned is not to trust the technology. That's why I wanted to have printouts in my hand. Now, here I would like to talk about spear campaigns and misinformation. I'll go back to an event that preceded this current crisis 7 or 8 years ago, and few months after the start of the Arab Spring. Indeed, in the cafes, in the houses, in the think tanks, in the headquarters of newspapers and so on and so forth, a question used to be posed vis-à-vis what takes place in the Arab world, and it relates to the role of Qatar and the role of Al Jazeera. And in a number of majlises or a number of cafe shops or other headquarters, people used to talk about the functional role of Qatar. People talked about conspiracy theory. People talked about Qatar as a host of the Americans through establishing the base, the military base, and indeed others used to talk about the soft power of Qatar and so on and so forth. All such theories used to be floated on the table in different locations. I was very fortunate at the time because I was transiting from being a journalist into becoming an academic. So I used to follow this debate wearing the journalist hat, and in others wearing the academic hat or the researcher. So indeed I was fortunate in issuing a book called The Public Diplomacy and the National Identity, applications thereby, and the model was Qatar. And in that book I alluded to the fact that what's important is to answer the question of the role of Qatar and Al Jazeera in the Arab world, away from any politicized answers, away from any theories, and away from anything else that was said. However, to talk about the nation branding, or to have our argument based on the nation branding, Simon Arnold is the author of this nation branding theory, and I looked at Qatar as being transformed to a brand rather than a small-sized country. It has become a national brand. Why it has become so? Because as the colleagues have said, small-sized countries do not protect themselves utilizing the military or political tools per se. Small-sized countries need military alliance, and that's why Qatar had signed a memorandum of understanding and mutual defense pact with Turkey, France, and the US. But this doesn't suffice. Here, we can talk about the formula of zero problems with the surrounding countries, and Qatar embarked on that matter, and indeed it settled the borders issue with Saudi Arabia. Small-sized countries also need to become brands, i.e., if Qatar was still confined to its small geographic and demographic size without becoming a brand, then this current crisis might have affected Qatar badly. However, since 1996, Qatar worked upon crystallizing such brand, and thus the international community cooperated with her. What do we mean by the brand? It means to have Qatar Charity Foundation, it means to have the Qatari Airways, it means to have Al Jazeera, it means to have the Qatar Center for Public Freedom, it means to host the World Cup. This represents the brand, and thus when Qatar was subject to such blockade, actually in my book in 2012 at the last page I said that the crisis is nigh, and as a matter of fact I wasn't an insider, and the politicians in Qatar knew that this crisis is coming. Now, when things flared up, when this crisis was triggered, and in accordance with the 13 demands submitted by the blockading countries, I came back to my book that was published in 2012, and I looked at the 13 demands and the 15 tools possessed by Qatar, starting from Al Jazeera and ending by hosting the World Cup. Indeed, the 13 demands seek to disintegrate this brand, to disintegrate this effort, to withdraw the right of hosting the World Cup, the terrorism issue, focusing or targeting the charities, and so on and so forth. So, if you look at the soft power of Qatar, the nation branding, and the 15 tools, they can be matched indeed to the 13 demands, whereby the 13 demands would end up disintegrating every single tool if they were successful. However, I'll go back now to my paper and the title, The Smear Campaigns and Misinformation. I was cognizant to the fact that in 1996 Qatar embarked on orchestrating nationally all its efforts. That means everybody in Qatar ought to sing from the same hymn sheet to defend Qatar and to defend its role. These blockading countries, those countries wanted to follow the same orchestra kind of related maneuver, whereby they threw every single egg in the basket, and they wanted, and indeed they did, launch a fierce attack with the 13 demands all at once, following rather 3 parallel tracks, but at the same time they were orchestrated simultaneously. First, the traditional diplomacy, and the new media and the traditional media, and more ominously what we call the parallel diplomacy. The traditional diplomacy, as we know, just straight after the hacking of the website and the attacks thereby by the Sky News and Al Arabiya, the Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Jubair and Abdullah bin Zayed, the Foreign Minister of the UAE, they were shuttling backwards and forwards in order for the international community to support them in the pursuit of severing the ties with Qatar, criminalizing Qatar, leveling charges on Qatar. And this traditional diplomacy was afoot, and it followed two parallels. The first one was amongst the 4 blockading countries, and on the 23rd of June they agreed to submit 13 demands, and then on the 7th of July they had also met, and they said that Qatar did not meet the demands. And lastly, the 30th or the 31st of July's meeting was held in Bahrain. So this traditional diplomacy, we noted that it was propelled through shuttle diplomacy. They went and they met the German counterparts and the French and other countries, and this took place 72 hours after the hacking. In parallel to this traditional diplomacy, as Mr. Noureddine has said, we've seen and witnessed what the media has played. The media outlets did not confine themselves to Sky News, Al Arabiya, or the other press, national newspapers. However, it depended also on foreign media outlets, some of which were bought, some of which were blackmailed. And I was in London, and I noticed some of the the right-leaning newspapers, the Daily Telegraph and Daily Express, and they used to publish articles accusing Qatar of supporting terrorism, and then 2 or 3 days later they would have an article or an advert to talk about tourism in Dubai and so on and so forth. So I have understood that this advert is being paid for in order to publish the first article. In parallel to that, Twitter was brimful of comments and tweets. For Trump to be amongst the orchestra, you need to sing from the same hymn sheet that he sings from, i.e. tweets, because he loves Twitter. Gergash and Dahi Khalfan, the head of Dubai police, Al-Qahtani and others in Saudi Arabia, resorted to Twitter, and they become masters. So here I've talked about the orchestra, the traditional diplomacy, the media, but the third was the more ominous, what I call the parallel diplomacy. The parallel diplomacy is the number of tools that include public diplomacy, PR, lobbying, and think tanks. And you do notice that, especially in the United States of America and in the UK, these tools or these mechanisms used to be utilized, and the UAE ambassador Al-Utaiba and his leaks and his emails and so on and so forth shed light clearly on two matters. First, the keenness of the Emirates in such parallel diplomacy in order to demonize Qatar, in order to provoke the international community against Qatar. And the other issue is that the crisis has not started with a mere hacking or just a hacking process and misquoting the emir. The issue goes back to the previous decade, not only 2014, and the evidence is that the Emirates was very active in the USA since 2013. I might here read the Sunlight report, the institution that looks into the impact of such maneuvers. The Washington Post has quoted this. It says that the UAE in 2013 was at the top of the list of those countries who paid huge amounts of money to the lobbies in America, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was ranked 4th. Al-Otaiba ambassador and along with him PR companies in Britain and in the USA had launched campaigns. Some of them had led to certain protests at the Qatari embassy in the UK. And what was outlandish or weird, that in September 2013, before the first crisis, one of the protests before the Qatari embassy was to do with carrying banners that condemn Qatar as being supporting of terrorism and linking Qatar to Hamas, and also trying to work on withdrawing the right of hosting the World Cup from Qatar. So that had started earlier. The demonizing process started earlier. And without taking much of your time, I would like to give you two examples. The first example is in the UK, and it was divulged that the PR company Quilla in Britain, whereby the national spokesperson that spoke in Arabic, Gerard Russell, was one of its members. And when I was in London, I've noticed that they work directly and on a daily basis with the UAE embassy in London and with the other media outlets in order to recruit journalists to write essays that, as I said, aim at demonizing Qatar and to create a media-related discourse that accuses Qatar of terrorism and its relationship thereby with Iran, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, and everything that provokes the public opinion and transforms Qatar to perhaps a proxy of terrorism in the region as such. In the United States of America, Al-Otaiba, the ambassador, used to work with the Commerstol, a PR company, and this company used to organize lobbying campaigns and recruit journalists, indeed, and attend conferences and so on and so forth. And the aim was to publish essays in the American media, and the aim was pretty much the same. In order to conclude, I would like to say in a nutshell, everything that took place resembled the parallel diplomacy, and as I said, it was orchestrated to demonize Qatar. These smear campaigns were afoot and promoting to the incapability of Qatar to host the World Cup, accusing Qatar of incubating terrorism and funding terrorism, demonizing Al Jazeera, Al Arabi TV, and the Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper for provoking hatred and so on and so forth, and also to smear the campaigns launched by the charities and the civil society in Qatar, as well as inflicting harm. And this is important. That's why the Qatari discourse was confronting this issue, talking about being subservient to Iran, talking about lacking of sovereignty and so on and so forth. And thus the Qatari diplomats and the narrative and the only speech by His Highness the Emir emphasized the issue of independence, sovereignty of Qatar, and they underline the fact that the solution of this crisis ought to be the dialogue based on independence and sovereignty. Thank you.
يعطيكم العافية. سمعنا يعني
We have listened to a set of presentations, significant and important presentation. Dr. Nawaf Al-Tamimi from the Doha Institute, Noureddine Miladi from Qatar University, Deborah and Wheeler and Brannon Wheeler from the USA, talking about the media aspect of the Qatar blockade and public relations. I believe this stirs many questions, and I encourage you, if you have comments, please make them very short. We are running short of time, so please make your comments short and ask more questions so that we can exploit their presence with us, and so that we can explore more on from their research papers. I thought that the crisis was a media crisis rather than political. What I've heard today was, and unfortunately, nothing new was added except for Dr. Tamimi, what the doctor and our colleagues from the USA is something repeated. The doctor gave us news from Sky News and the Arabiya. The question is that are we in a political crisis or in a media crisis? When I listened to the presentations, I thought that it's a media crisis. We'll take several questions.
Are you getting the translation for the question? Is it a crisis of media or a political crisis? And his comment was that he heard more political and less media. But anyway, your comment. So please.
I would like to thank all the panelists for their presentations. Doctor, please, my direct question is, Dr. Noureddine, regarding the using the discourse analysis tool, can we use it? Because the samples were news rather than articles, they were news stories. So my question, can we use discourse analysis in analyzing news stories, whereas it's more into articles? My other question is that the discourse analysis has to use proofing, and you're using the introduction and the title. I believe it would be more useful if you extended the analysis. So discourse analysis. I would like, thank you, Dr. Shafeeq. My name is Abdullah Al-Kindi from Oman. I have a comment, considering the current Gulf crisis, we are all losers in this, the people of this region. No one is a winner, and even if there is any victory, is going to be everyone, Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, everyone. Therefore, we can't depict any winner party over the other. Also, my colleague's comment is that the issue is purely political and not media based, and it's not moral. Ethics or media ethics is far removed from the media functioning, because the media in this part of the world is controlled by the governments completely, and separating the state media and the government media has never been achieved in this region. What we have learned is that media control is a manifestation of the state's control. Let's talk about the structure. The only exception is Kuwait. Is the Kuwaiti media in this crisis is different and diversified. We can see both perspectives in Kuwait. other media networks, including Iman, are either neutral or without any balance, including the Qatari media. I would like to allude to the structure of media in this region to understand what's going on. I would like to comment in the first commenter. I would like to say that the papers presented are flawless, and this is a mistake, and everything presented by the panelists is a sound scientific research. They say that Al-Arabiya and Scan News said so and so. However, when an academic professor analyzes the courses, this is something new, and it enforces truth. We can separate media from politics. There is intricacies. The crisis is political and media crisis, and the media has poured more oil on the fire. Now, concerning ethics, if we recall the media over the crisis, 6 months is nothing new. Like if we review the British media on the Falkland Islands, we would find that the British media was biased towards the British forces. Even the American media was biased towards the American intervention in Kuwait and in Iraq. The American media has given a blanket to confirming that Saddam has links with Al-Qaeda. These are two lies, and therefore they have misled the American public opinion, and therefore America waged a war against Iraq. I just want to ask a question to Dr. Milad concerning the papers parallel to the Saudi Arabia and UAE. There are local newspapers here in Qatar. Was there some sort of measuring or assessment in the Qatari newspapers? To what extent were they balanced? To my colleagues from the USA, you spoke about the use of religion. I didn't understand how USA and Qatar used religion in the crisis. So if they can explain
what you meant by the utilization of religion in your presentation.
As for Dr. Nawaf, if the tools used by Saudi Arabia and UAE in Europe from conventional diplomacy, Qatar itself also used such tools or means after 6 months into the crisis, if we are to see the horn locking between the two sides, who won, who lost, and what are the levels of success on both sides? First of all, I would like to appreciate the efforts exerted by all the researchers. My comment is to Dr. Noureddine Miladi. It's true that the paper relies on an analytical benchmarking that takes the text in its political and ideological context. However, there are constraints and limits in such analysis, because it stereotypes the outcomes of the study or the outputs of the study. Therefore, it would be more appropriate to relate to ethnography of communication. This actually would allow you to study the communication ethnography, what is called by Harms the communication model, which is the network of the event, and this would help you more to consider other dimensions such as the physical and the sociological framework. We are talking about news stories, actors, the tone, the intentions, and therefore this is a large aspect that can enrich the study. First of all, I would like to that I am the owner of the first issue on the crisis in Qatar under the title Qatar's Blockade. It's a monitoring and a follow-up on all the attack that was waged by the blockading countries against Qatar, and how our how Qatar in terms of people and leadership has stood against such an attack, and of course focusing on a particular type of media outlets, particularly from the Saudi networks, is appreciated. However, he overlooked other the UAE, but also Egypt, that has barged itself in this crisis without any justification, without any rational supporting its intervention in the Gulf issues and the propagation of lies. I believe this should be part of Noureddine's study, to focus on the Egyptian media, from which in the past we have learned credibility and honesty. Last question. My name is Dr. Nawaf. He spoke about the use of some individuals on Twitter. Did he use these people to represent the formal or official media dimension, and how much did such participations on such media exacerbate?
We'll go maybe from here all the way, and you have 2 minutes each, maybe around that, 2-3 minutes, to answer these questions.
I would like to thank all the people who ask questions. I will just give some. There is nothing new in what has been monitored in the analyzing media outlets. The normal or regular viewer in any country might have an eye or a lens through which they can see and analyze media, but this remains only talks and not based on scientific research methods. Therefore, the scientific work needs proposition and research tools, research methodology, and hypothetical framework, and then analysis the outcomes, and such work that can turn into scientific papers and textbooks that can be benefited from in universities and students in scientific and scholarly institutions. This conference is not a media conference, it's a scholarly conference, and therefore such distinction is very important. I admit that we fall short on covering further dimensions. However, with further efforts, we can expand more on such work. Regarding the questions related to the approach and methodology, I don't disagree with you. However, I need to point out that in many cases when we work in scientific research, time and available resources, be it financial and human resources and efforts, actually sets and determines the approach and the volume, and therefore I totally agree with all the people who commented. If I used the content analysis, I would have had much profound conclusions, therefore talking about the scientific approach and scientific method. And I do really appreciate that. Mr. Khalid spoke about excluding Egypt. It's true. Egypt, it's worth studying. I just wanted to focus on the Gulf countries in this case.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I'll answer part of it, and she can answer part. So, talking about religion as a weapon, we were specifically talking about Hajj denial, for example, and we have a list in our paper of 40 different instances where the Hajj has been denied to Muslims in the modern period. And part of what I was focusing on was the fact that this is being used as a weapon shows that this is the thing about which Saudi Arabia is most insecure. And if you think about the other demands that it places upon Qatar, for example, denouncing different forms of Islam as terrorism, denouncing the Muslim Brotherhood, denouncing Iran, both of which are a threat to Saudi Arabia's leadership of the Islamic world, the non-historical claims that Saudi Arabia has as guardianship of the two holy places, and we could talk as well about the Quranic injunction against tyranny or authoritarian rule that would not allow for participatory government.
Thank you.
And the other half of the religion as a weapon comes from the blockading of food imports during Ramadan. One of the most important rituals that the community participates in. And when I was working as a consultant with the Qatar National Food Security Program, when we did our risk scenarios, we never imagined that all three ports or places for the entry of food would be blockaded at the same time. It was always only thought of in terms of 1 point of blockade or 2 points of blockade. So the fact that all three were blocked at the same time during Ramadan is a sign of religion as a weapon. And just to kind of give you some numbers, 45% of Qatar's food and water, imported water, comes through the sea, and then 55% comes through the Saudi border crossing. So if you add those two together, you'll know that about 3% was coming in by air. So to blockade that during Ramadan was a use of religion as a threat. And we see also Qatar's skill in navigating very, very quickly to replace supply of food. And that demonstrates what Dr. Badi talked about this morning, that because of globalization and interdependence, it's very easy to maneuver and even refitting Qatar airline planes to import dairy cows. So supposedly, I haven't seen it, I would love to visit if somebody has a means. Supposedly Qatar now has its own dairy for producing milk and erected in 2 weeks. So we're talking about very, very interesting times. In terms of the political analysis then media, I believe, as some of the other people have commented, it's very difficult in this day and age to separate the two. The Twitter realm is an example especially important in my country right now because our president tends to announce things using this tool. And the other thing is we are seeing new media technologies as a tool of state, even more so than society. And we have to remember that this conflict started through a hack, okay? The hacking and placing of text within one of Sheikh Tamim's speeches, and the whole leaking of Otaibe's personal emails as another form of kind of information warfare, which was one of the tactics that we were looking at in our study. So very hard to distinguish between politics and media at this point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Nawaf.
طيب أنا في عجالة أولا أقول بأنه
Very quickly, I would like to say that the crisis is is a political crisis, and the media is just a tool in this crisis. And in our presentation, we said these are some of the mechanisms, some of the tools. One of the other important things of our colleague from Oman. Yes, we are all losers in this crisis, and I, as a Palestinian, I would say we are the first losers, the people of the Palestinian cause. And I have written an article. Let's monitor what happens under the dust of this crisis, because yes, there is a dust, but there is something beneath and under the dust, which we call the deal of the century. Going back to the comment, Mr. Al-Bayyari, yes, Qatar has always been a proactive in 1996, has always been using parallel diplomacy in building the nation brand, the Qatari nation brand. But who wins, who loses if it's about scoring points? I would say the first point was for Qatar, that Qatar has defeated the conventional diplomacy approach of Saudi Arabia through attracting key international players such as the European and the American. Also, these blockading countries failed with regards to Al Jazeera channel. I give two examples, as one has written in the British, The Guardian in the UK, said that such countries demanding the closure of Al Jazeera is exactly as if China would demand the shutdown of the BBC. In the French Le Monde said that demanding the closure of Al Jazeera is exactly similar to requests or demands to close or shut down Le Monde when we criticize human rights in Morocco or in Algeria. Yes, in terms of winning and losing, the media has lost big part of its ethics. However, the media has also won many other friends to support and defend autonomy and independence of media. Therefore, I believe we need to wait till the dust settles to have a true and real final analysis to weigh and measure who won and who lost and to what extent. I would like to thank all the panelists and all the participants. I believe more discussions are to come in the future, and thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.